had the Martian Chronicles and Fahrenheit 451 in my house. And part of the reason was Ray Bradbury had spoken at the local Kiwanis Club in Southern California, and he didn't drive, as many people, as Bradbury heads know. And my grandfather drove him home a couple of times. And, you know, when you meet a famous person and you're not in Hollywood or anything, it's this huge deal. And so we had his books for that reason. And then I read the Martian Chronicles when I was 12. And it was the first time I really connected. It's the first time I realized, oh, I might be like a sci-fi fantasy fan.
Well, my father is a huge science fiction fan. And so growing up, we had all of the classic sci-fi authors' works in the house. And I remember stumbling across Illustrated Man on our shelves when I was, I want to say, 10 to 12. And there was also a collection of short science fiction short stories that was published long before I was born that had a couple of stories of Bradbury's in there. And I forget the title of that collection, but I remember being caught by the cover of the Illustrated Man because it had the illustrated tattooed man on the cover. I was like, what is this about? And I read those stories very young. And also my family and I watched the TV adaptation of the Martian Chronicles. And all of those had an enormous influence on me. I mean, they just sank deep into my brain like, I want to say half-remembered dreams, but they're deeply remembered.
I encountered Ray Bradbury's work actually during a formative period in my writing career. So it was, just out of high school, maybe early college. I was trying to read a lot of the foundational writers, and short stories are my first love. So I devoured his The Illustrated Man and October Country, and that was basically my introduction to Ray Bradbury. And then from there, actually, since I was really in exploring a lot of the horror spaces, I also went ahead and read his Something Wicked This Way Comes. So yeah, that was my Ray Bradbury initial encounter.
My favorite work is still the first work I ever read, Martian Chronicles. It is so centered in the human experience. And while the setting of Mars and the idea of meeting aliens and all of that is, obviously I'm a sucker for that kind of stuff. But what Bradbury did so well with that and why I love it is that it was so focused on what happens to our humanity in different circumstances.
But another one that I think really speaks to me in a lot of ways, because I read it almost immediately after I first read Martian Chronicles, because I was like, who is Ray Bradbury and where can I find more of his stuff, is Something Wicked This Way Comes. And it was a perfect book for a 12-year-old boy to be reading, because the protagonists in the story were of an age, right? These were not just adults doing adult things, and I could sit there and be thinking like, oh, when I'm an adult, I can be like this. It's like, no, the characters were me. The characters were my friends. The characters were doing things and had interests and had, concerns that were familiar to me as someone who was on the cusp of puberty. And the way that Bradbury wrote about the characters and the way that he made this sort of magical world of adulthood that was also simultaneously scary and forbidding, and also made you realize that there was the battle of good and evil is not necessarily monumental evil versus, monumental good with everything on a pedestal. The fact that the father is there, the fact that, this is someone that, the kids encounter every day and is the avatar for good in that story makes a huge difference. It was the one that sticks with me the most in a lot of ways.
The touchstone book I most frequently return to is the Martian Chronicles, published in 1950. I think that book, everything that makes Ray Bradbury, he was hitting on all rocket cylinders with that work. The social commentary, he was addressing concerns of racism and environmental destruction and corporatization, the decimation of a native people, colonialism. He was addressing big, deep, rich human themes that have vexed humanity for generations, but he was addressing them through the prism of science fiction set on the surface of Mars. So along with the deep thematic aspects of the book, he was hitting everything on all rocket cylinders with the level of the quality of the prose itself. Bradbury was a poet, a prose poet, and the language and lyrical nature of his words, I think, is no better identified than within 1950s The Martian Chronicles. So that's probably my favorite book.
Where you have to look at the work and you have to go, does this still speak? Is this something that is still applicable to life? And I think with Bradbury, the answer is yes, it is, because he was not just interested in rocket ships, and that he was not just interested in the science of whatever, when the science inevitably ages out. I mean, the Martian world that he imagined in the Martian Chronicles is not scientifically what we know the Martian world to be. But like something like Frankenstein, the stories transcend the science. The story is, because the story is not about the science. The story is about the people who are in these worlds that he's imagined.
The reason that I think most writers should read Ray Bradbury, and I teach him, is because he understands the specificity of language. Everything that he writes has this rhythm and cadence to it that elevates the language into kind of pure storytelling. I don't think that he is writing poetically for the sake of being poetic, but for the sake of bringing an emotional experience to the reader.
Well, Ray Bradbury predicted a lot of things. I believe it's in Fahrenheit 451. The protagonist's wife has basically earbuds in all the time and doesn't listen to her husband. She'd rather stare at screens. There are a lot of predictions. He literally talks also in Fahrenheit 451 about this idea of thought crime, which we are, seeing for good and bad right now. And again, like, emotion is emotion. Humanity is humanity. No matter how many screens are around us, no matter how much technology changes, we're still going to have deep down the same wants, the same desires, the same ways we're hurt, the same ways we dream. That doesn't change.